name is BJ Buckley. I'm a Wyoming and Montana poet, writer, and visual artist, and teaching artist for the past 45 years. I've been writing poetry since I was very small. I lived in a household where my parents read poetry to us quite a lot from the time we were very little. And I went to school during the 1950s, during that time when part of our English classes was both reading and memorizing poems. So I've had that music of language in my head for a very, very long time. I didn't really start doing visual arts until I started working in schools. My work involves going into schools, community centers, libraries, museums, hospitals, and other healthcare centers, and doing poetry and art with children, adults, patients. I work with special needs students sometimes. I had a residency very early on in my 20s, and I arrived at the school, and the class I was going to had sent one of their students to meet me. And as we were walking down the hallway, he asked if he could tell me something and he wouldn't get in trouble. And I said, of course. And he said, we were supposed to get an artist. We were supposed to get an artist, and we got you instead. And I said to him, but I'm an artist. And he says, no, you're just doing writing. And I went, oh goodness, to myself, and said, no, 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 we're going to make books. And of course, I had no preparation at that moment for making any kind of book with kids. And I said, and we're going to illustrate them. By the time we got to the classroom, I had rehearsed in my head a sort of outline of what we would do. We would write first, and we would make books at the end of the week, figuring I could teach myself to do something by Friday. And that was pretty much how doing art with kids started. As a child in junior high school, I probably was 12 or 13, we had a Japanese exchange student who taught all of us how to do origami. So I've been folding origami since I was a kid as well, and started doing that in classrooms in connection with writing Japanese style poetry, with writing haiku and tanka, and found that the kids liked that quite a lot. As I got into my 40s and 50s and started working at museums, started doing multimedia arts with special needs people first and with grade school people second. On my own, because I liked the Japanese art forms, I started doing Japanese ink painting. In the course of my residencies, I met another artist who taught me how to do the paper marbling kinds of things. And so I began to add some of those extra things to the books that I made.
What inspired you? Of course, working with children, you chose topics that would appeal to them, but you were also writing. What inspired you?
Even though I grew up in a town, I had that generation of parents who used to shove you outdoors at every opportunity. And so I spent a lot of time outside, and my neighborhood was a neighborhood of big yards. There was a cemetery across the street. There were parks within a couple of blocks. And so I was very enamored of the natural world. My mother had gardens. I liked watching animals and insects and birds. And as I grew older, I moved into more rural situations and spent many, many, many hours outside. That continues to be, I think, the major inspiration for most of my written work. The plants, the animals, the landscape, the sky, the weather. And in addition, the interactions between those things and the people who live in those settings, and their voices and their work. So that's been ongoing pretty much throughout my poetry writing life.
Did you have a favorite poet or a writer?
I think very early on, Robert Frost was a favorite of mine because I liked the music of the language, and also because many of his poems came from rural settings. As I've gotten older, it's very hard to pick a favorite poet because every new one I encounter becomes my favorite for a while. But American poet Mary Oliver, American poet Patty Ann Rogers, a prose writer and poet, a gentleman named J. Drew Lanham, who is a professor of ecology at a university in South Carolina, is now one of my favorite writers. So I go back to the American canon of that gorgeous musical rhymed verse, and I also try and keep reading new poets. A poet I just discovered is another American poet, a Black woman named Camille Dungy, who has a very different take on the natural world, partly because she has a family and children and because her interactions are intermittent. She's just a wonderful poet, and I like her work very much.
Nature, birds, animals are present in your poetry. Are they also specific symbols for certain emotions or messages, or you let the readers to assign their own meanings?
I'm a pretty unsentimental poet. If you live outside in the natural world, you see the very unpretty parts as well as the beautiful ones, and the hard parts as well as the easy ones. So when I write, I'm trying to do two things. I'm trying to give a clear enough, detailed enough picture of the place that I am in and the animal or the landscape that I'm looking at. And I'm also trying to give an idea of what it's like to be or work or live in that place, so that a person, if I make myself unobtrusive enough, that they could stand next to me and see what I see and hear what I hear. That said, I have a special place in my heart for great blue herons. They're a huge bird, and they're common throughout the West. And they're very dangerous birds to their prey. They eat fish, they eat frogs, they spear them with their beaks. They're just gorgeous, huge animals, and I've always felt it's sort of good luck to see one. And I go looking for them as soon as it gets warm enough in the spring. There are large rookeries in the cottonwood trees in many places that I've lived, and seeing them come back for me is the real sign of spring.
As a poet, writer, and visual artist, how do you spend each season? Because winters are quite harsh.
I grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and if anyone gets on the computer, you can always find pictures of the blown over sideways semis down there. It's very windy. So I've grown up in places with harsh winters, and I had a very good friend when I first moved up into ranch country who told me there's no bad weather, there's just bad clothes. So I became good at getting clothes that I could be outside in. When I lived in ranch country, I didn't own the animals, but the owner would come and say, can you help with this, or can you help with that? So we fed cattle when it was 40 below zero. We helped with branding. We go look for sheep when we round them up in the fall. The country I live in now in Montana is more farm country than ranch country. A lot of grain and alfalfa and hay raising and legumes. But people do have animals, and so I do get outside to help with lambing or with helping people move cows. So you just, you get used to being outside. Occasionally it is really too cold. We had double digits below zero all week, and in those days you don't go out any more than you absolutely have to. It gets hot here too in the summer, in the high 90s and hundreds, and that's a different kind of a climate to adapt to. But most people in the West are just used to it. We're just outside all the time.
I always had this perception of people living in Montana that they are people of few words but a lot of action.
And I think that's very true for rural people in the West, not just Montana, Wyoming. When you're out there, there's a lot to do. Communication's important if you're working with animals because it can be dangerous. If you're trying to build something, if you're trying to move hay bales that can weigh 10 or 11 tons each, the big round bales, so that communication tends to be short and to the point. And if you have ever tried to make your living as a farmer or a rancher, it's a very hard life sometimes. And people are very stoic. They don't talk about their personal life or their feelings very often, or to a great extent, even to their friends and their families. So I've been privileged, I think, especially in Wyoming, that I lived there almost 20 years, that people became comfortable enough with me and with having me around that they did talk about some of those things. I have a couple of poems that sort of address that verbal reticence. Because I think people have the idea that people up here don't have feelings, and that's not true. But if you're out and working, you can't let those feelings surface many times if you're going to do what has to be done.
When you are working in your studio, let's say when you're doing bookmaking or origami, how does this work? Do you do sketches? Do you collect your materials? How do you do that?
Origami, I've been very lucky to live in a time when the paper to do it with has been available, either in craft stores or online. And as I said, I was taught as a 12 or 13-year-old by a friend, and there's wonderful books. I don't really have a studio so much. When I was teaching all the time and I was gone much of each school year, in each school they would give me a place to work, so I would have that during the day. But my studio often tends to be, a little table at my local library, or the kitchen counter after dinner is done, and I can stand up and clean a small space and fold animals. Origami doesn't take a lot of space for the most part if you're doing smaller work. Bookmaking, I now have to do outside my house because I have so many cats that it's almost impossible to find somewhere with no cat hair in it. So I have a place out in the shop in warm weather where I have a table out there that I can work. And I have a little table they let me use at the library. If I go to a school, and I have gone a couple of times this year to a school to do just one-day things, then I'll stay after school and make some things. But I have pretty much learned to do whatever I do sort of on the run and with whatever space and time is available, especially writing. I keep a little notebook in my pocket. And now I have my wonderful phone, so I can take notes on that no matter where I am. So that's been a great tool for me.
During the pandemic, did you have the chance to do any origami workshops?
No, I didn't. The area of the West that I live in is very politically divided. And even now, less than half the people are vaccinated at all. Most of them don't have boosters. The schools this year have only just reopened. And very few people are doing the kind of residency work that I do because the kids are behind from having not been able to be in the classroom most of last year.
Are you able to travel to other states and do some work?
Not since 2019. The states that I have been working in were North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. And if you look at a map that shows you vaccination rates or positive test rates, all of those states are still very, very high. I have gone into my local senior center and done a poetry day, those old folks, because they and I are all vaccinated and we just masked up and felt pretty safe. But things out here in the West have really not resumed any kind of normality yet.
You mentioned working with older population. Are you doing poetry with them or also arts?
Both. For about 8 years, I worked at a cancer center hospital in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And we did both visual arts and writing stories, writing poems. I was not the only artist who came in there. We sort of would come in, they'd have a visual artist or a dancer or a musician. But we sat in the reception areas and worked with both patients waiting for treatment and their families. We met with the nurses. We often went even to the bedside of people who had treatment that was ongoing for a while. So we made, one of the things we did is we made collaborative books. We would pick a theme. One of the ones we did is everybody had a button box when they were a child. I did anyway, because your parents mended things. And we talked about the memories from the button boxes and going through them when you were a child and remembering particular buttons. And we made a big book that looked like a button with buttons stuck all over it, and people recorded people's stories and drawings in it, and then that would go out in the reception area. We did that at Christmas with Christmas stories, so they were like collaborative books. Visual arts, we did everything from little handmade books to, I did mostly origami. There's the lady who I learned paper marbling from, would do paper marbling. Visual artists go in and do printmaking. So it's a wide variety. That program, I understand, is still ongoing, although I stopped participating in it a number of years ago.
Are they also writing poems? Are you collecting the poems and putting them together in a booklet, chapbook?
What we did a variety of things. I would do a prompt that would be, say a memory of learning to play a musical instrument, and we would put a big easel with a big white pad on it and colored markers. And as people would come through, I would say, can you tell me something you remember about hearing music or playing music or your music teacher when you were a kid? And by the end of the day, we would have a long list of people's memories, and we would leave that out on display. Later on, we started doing that and putting them into a small book that would then stay in the reception room. Some people actually wrote haiku poems with me a few times, and again, we would put those in a little book and make a decorative cover and leave it in the waiting room so that as other people came in, they could pick it up and read, and that also sort of served as a stimulus. You know, I could say, oh, you're looking at that. Would you like to come write something with me, or would you like to come make, you know, a little animal, or would you like to paint a bookmark or something like that? So that's how we preserved those. Again, most of them without names, because medical regulations don't let us put people's names on things that are going to be out in the public. So it was a nice way for people to share things.
You published 3 books, and you are now just being published a 4th one. Would you like to talk about your books?
Sure. Let me talk about the new one for a moment. There's a wonderful magazine called the Comstock Poetry Review that's celebrating 35 years, and each year they have a chapbook contest for a collection of about 40 pages of poems. And this year I'm very happy to say that I won that competition. So that is the new little book that will be coming out. It's called In January, the Geese. Here is a little poem from the new book. You had mentioned your idea of Montana, that people don't talk very much. Out here we have little convenience stores in most of the small towns that generally have gas pumps, and you go in and there's usually some kind of rolls and coffee and pop and fast food that people will grab, and they'll go in there early, a lot of especially the men, to talk to the other guys, get a cup of coffee before they go out to work. sometimes very early. So this poem is called C-Store. We call them C-Stores. 5 a.m. It smells of burning, acrid scent of old hay, ditch grass, last year's stubble. Yesterday they trenched firebreak around the fields, and even the kids helped dribble gas for torch lines. Lit walls of flame raced orange-red before the wind across spent acres. Left blackened ground, soot and ash sifting out of the air with darkness. Now, before first light, stolid, taciturn, square-built men in grain store gimme caps hold foam cups of scalding coffee in their blunt-fingered hands, the blackened nails and missing digits eloquent of the difficulty of the work, of its cost. They listen to the ag report, look down at the floor, shake their heads. Some go back for donuts or a sausage roll, a second cup. Today they disk everything under. Might rain. Almost no one says a single word.
It sounds to me that life can get very hard in that area.
I think any area that depends on ranching or farming or raising animals, the last few years has been much harder than usual. The climate change effects are profound. We have not had any rain here since almost a year ago, March. There's been very little snow. We were completely covered with smoke from fires all summer long in 90-degree weather, which made being outside very difficult. The area I live in now grows beer barley for Coors and Budweiser, American beer companies. And it needs heat at the right time and enough water at the right time, and it needs not to be rained on after it gets ripe. And so they've had a couple of very hard agricultural years here, and we were one of the better places in Montana last year. This year, I don't know how long the irrigation water is going to last because we've had almost no snow. So it can be a very hard and challenging kind of life, at the same time that it's an incredibly beautiful, beautiful place. I live up on a bench, an agricultural bench, and you can see from my yard mountains all around in every direction. We're not really far from the Rocky Mountain front to the west and to the smaller mountain ranges to the east. So it's very, very beautiful. But it can be difficult to make a living and to stay sort of with your head above water here. Can I find you perhaps a little more cheerful poem? There are a lot of raptors, of hawks and eagles and owls out here, and most of them stay through the winter. And there are great horned owls who nest in the cottonwood trees very close to where I live. And they'll come and they'll sit there for hours and hours and hours and call back and forth to each other. And although it's winter, great horned owls mate and begin making their nests usually in January. So by February, the female is usually in the nest and sitting on at least one, if not more than one egg, and the male will be in the area calling out to establish a territory. So this is a poem called Watchman, about a night when I watched and listened to a great horned owl call back and forth with another one for quite a long time. Watchman. Last night in early evening, a great horned owl appeared in one of the silvery ash snags, on a branch so thin it seemed a wonder that it held him, all fluffed up in the freezing wind, huge, watchful, silent in his survey of the yard before him, the alfalfa field behind, sturdy and steady as the branch shook and swayed, eyes golden sparks of the leaving light, until the sky dimmed matte gray-blue and he was silhouette backlit by cloud, then a darker shape than darkness, patient, expectant. The first call came from the treeless hayfield east across the gravel road, challenge and query, invisible interlocutor. He answered, deeper, more resonant. And so for hours after, hours, that ancient antiphon echoed and re-echoed above the moan and wail of wind, above its headlong rush through branch and brush and last year's dry grasses, claiming a world we have no claim to, world of blood and night and song.
The English language is a very melodious language. How do you connect with the language? Do you practice writing poetry a lot? Do you read poetry a lot?
Because my writing time has, until the last couple of years, had to be more or less stolen from my working day. I've gotten used to working on little snatches of poems in my head. I've always read poetry for pleasure, whether I'm working or not. Sometimes I have more time than not. And of course, when I'm working, especially with children in schools, we're writing poetry all the time. And so I bring poems into them from a wide variety of authors and in a wide variety of styles as models. To read out loud and talk about what the sound does in addition to the meaning of the words. And of course, I grew up hearing poetry my whole childhood. So the resonances of language have been with me a long time. That music, sometimes when I'm thinking about writing a poem, sort of musicality or a rhythm or a set of sounds will come into my head before the actual words are there, and then I will be looking for words to fit that sort of verbal melody that's in my head. That happens sometimes.
You have worked with many generations of children over the years. How do you find that they understand the language from generation to generation? Did you see any changes, considering that the pop culture kind of altered the language?
Sometimes. The thing I mostly see is that 20 years ago, kids had a longer attention span. I could work in longer sections. I've learned recently to break up any lessons we do or any activities that I do into much smaller, much shorter intervals. But kids are very eager to share their stories and very eager to talk and very eager to write their own ideas and their own images and their own take on the world down on paper, because in school they're almost always writing about a book they read or they're writing a report on something. It's not theirs. And so when they get a chance to write from their own heart and from their own lives and from their own experience, they're just as eager now as they always were. I have also found that if we are making things in the classroom, I can't make as complicated of things anymore as I used to be able to do, or things that I used to be able to do with a younger age group, say a third or a fourth grader. I can't do that with them anymore. I have to do that with older kids. And that's the biggest effect that I've seen. They still get exposed to an awful lot of language that isn't just short tweets or abbreviations, although we've had great fun writing poetry tweets, trying to rhyme with them. So, you know, what I do is try and take what they're familiar with, what they're doing with every day, and frame it in a different way and sort of work backward from that into something more musical and a little bit longer.
Graphic novels are very popular with children. Have you ever considered doing a graphic chapbook or graphic novel using poetry or writing?
I work on rosters, artist rosters in several states when I'm working, and it's quite fun that in every state I work there is at least one person whose art form is to go and do graphic novels with kids. So when schools have residencies, there's a person who does that available in most of the states I work with. I have not done that, largely because when I meet with a group of kids in a classroom, usually during a week-long residency, I will have one group of kids that I will see every day for about 45 minutes or an hour. And then depending on the school, I may see other classes only once. So mostly I concentrate on doing writing first. And then I've been lucky to have many, many teachers who will then take the kids a little further on in the process and have them do illustrations. Or I do workshops with teachers and then provide them with the materials to do a book with their class. And that has been a way of sort of leveraging my time with them.
You are making books, you're writing books, but in this digital age, everything is on Kindle. Children are online. They lost that physical connection with a physical book. How do you rekindle that connection in your workshops?
I don't really think that they have lost that. It's either an advantage or a disadvantage depending on how desperately you need it. But there is no such thing as high-speed internet in Western states, regardless of what they tell you. Maybe Denver in Colorado. But there are many places where I live where internet is just not available, except if you have a cell phone and if the weather is bad and there are some areas where the cell phone service doesn't reach. The part of the little local library where I am that gets the most use is the children's section. And they are in here taking armfuls of books every single day. Every classroom in the schools in my area, and in fact in Great Falls, which is the bigger town about 30 miles from us, every individual classroom has its own library. The schools have libraries. So I don't think that the kids have lost that book connection at all. Most children don't read on screen. They'll read books. Adults may do that. I started doing that only when it became more onerous to load boxes of books in my car than to download a few of them onto my phone to read. But I still read mostly physical books, as do most of the adult writers that I know. If you're writing, we are of necessity on screen a great deal. Because that's the tool we use. We use the laptop, we use the computer keyboard. And by the time you've done that for 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day, the last thing you want to do is look at a screen again. I really don't think that that connection is lost. Bookstores seem to be doing very well.
You mentioned at the very beginning that your writing is not very sentimental. However, when we read your poetry, when we read your writing, we can sense emotions, not, overwhelming sentiment, but we do sense emotions.
For me, sentimental is different than having feeling. I live in a state that borders part of Yellowstone Park, and I'm from Wyoming, where most of the park is. And it astonishes me how little the people who come from states where their exposure to nature and to wildlife is very small, how they behave as though a 2.5-ton animal like a bull bison is something they can walk up and pet. They have a very romanticized sort of fairy tale idea about nature. We lose people every year because they take off into very wild and difficult, dangerous country where the weather can change very quickly in shorts and sandals and t-shirt with no coat and no hat and no sense that they could really be in trouble 2 hours from now. So I guess what I mean by not sentimental is I don't romanticize it, and I don't leave out the parts that are difficult to look at, because it's such a beautiful place, and animals of all kinds are fascinating, just fascinating, whether they are sitting in your tree and hooting in a beautiful all-night melody, or whether the hawk is making off with the mallard off her nest and then sitting there where you can see her and tearing it apart. There's different aspects of that. So I guess that's when I mean sentimental, I mean not looking at things the way they are in the real world.
You mentioned that you have many cats at home. Do you have poems with cats. How do you bond with your cats? What attracts you so much to having cats around you?
Well, basically, if you live out in the country and you don't have at least one or two cats, you get overrun with mice. And it was not so much of a problem when I lived in ranch country. If you had a chicken coop, you had mice, or if you had smaller animals like rabbits, the mice will come in. But in farm country, where there is so much grain everywhere, barn cats are a necessity, and many people's barn cats are fairly wild. Mine are wilder than my house cats, my outside cats, but they do come up. I do feed them once a day so that I can see them and make sure they're okay and not hurt and, you know, in more or less good shape. I just like cats. We had one when I was a child who was really my sister's cat. But I liked having them around. And unfortunately, if you live out in the country, many people think that they can just take and dump their animals out there and they'll be fine because somebody will find them. So most of the inside cats I have showed up. Someone dumped cats, or it got lost, or it escaped from their car or something. So I have 7 inside right now. My very large butterscotch cat is half Maine Coon cat, and he weighs almost 20 pounds. And I got him on purpose from a neighbor because he's sort of orange colored and I'd always wanted them. But the other ones all came because somebody dumped them in our area and I brought them in. They're good company, you know. They'll sit on your lap and keep you warm, and they're funny to watch. We don't have television. I've never had television. You know, we sit around and watch the critters, and we also always have had dogs, a couple 3, 4 dogs, and right now we have 2 golden retrievers as well. So we are pretty loaded up in the critter category at my house. I have a book called Moon Horses and the Red Bull, which was done by a small press in Wyoming, and the editor of that press had a series called Women and Words, and what she did is she would pick two women writers whose work she thought would complement each other and put them in the same book. And I have a friend who's a wonderful writer. She writes children's stories, poetry, adult stories, and she's also a visual artist. And she has been doing the illustrations for all of the books I've had since my very first one. But she has poems in this book. It was my friend Dawn Trask and I are in this Moon Horses book. And so I thought I might read you a little poem about sheep. The ranch that I lived in Wyoming was 25,000 acres, had 5,000 or 6,000 sheep on it, cattle ranch as well, some horses, and had been sheep country for a long time. One of the things that was really fun for me once I got to know people up there is everywhere you lived, somebody else had lived there before, and there were all the stories of things that had gone on, the bad blizzards and the funny incidents. And right in the area where I lived, they used to have sheep herders who would come in wagons to watch the sheep during the summer when they would move them off them in the winter and during lambing. So this is a short poem about one of those old herders, and it's just called Sheep. In 1936, it got wet cold during lambing, and the old man brought in a twin the ewe wouldn't take, carried it into the basement. Dirt floor, smells of dry rot and potatoes. And he lay down, unbuttoned coat and shirt, and pulled the unwashed long johns away from his chest. So long since he'd laundered himself, the hair had grown clean through the cloth. And he put that lamb in against his belly, buttoned everything back over, went to sleep. Well, that one lived.
Rural life is not sufficiently represented in the media, in the movie industry. Most of the films we are seeing are urban or science fiction, futuristic. How would you encourage today's generation to get inspired more from the rural life and also understand it as it is and not as a place where people, might be behind or too populistic, or there's a great misunderstanding of rural population?
Yeah, I think in many cases there are. In fact, right now there's a movie that's nominated for the Academy Awards called The Power of the Dog, based on a book by a Montana writer named Thomas Savage of the same name. I think Benedict Cumberbatch is in it. It's not a pretty story, but it is very, very true to the kind of rural life that was here at a certain period of time. There are not a great many, movies. I grew up as a child. I lived in Wyoming, and the town I grew up in has Cheyenne Frontier Days, the largest outdoor rodeo in the world. And I had friends with ranches and friends who had horses I could ride, although I lived in town. But people tend to think because people are quiet, they're not smart, or because they don't talk a lot, they don't know things. And there just aren't a lot of movies that are accurate. There are some wonderful young Native American filmmakers making movies now here in the West. A number of Western states have passed incentives for people who make movies to come and make them in the settings in which they're depicting, instead of running off to somewhere else. A great many movies about Montana are actually made in Canada, just north of us, because the country is very much the same. There's some wonderful, one of the things I think that social media and access to things like YouTube make available is there are just some incredible documentary films about rural life in England and in France. And I just watched one about the big agricultural exposition in Paris. That was just amazing to me. I think that if people do come to visit a national park, I don't know how many people are traveling right now to the United States because of the pandemic, but the national parks here have always had a number of visitors from Europe and from Japan, that if you come out to visit a natural wonder like that, to leave a day or two to drive around and go visit a small town and go to the grocery store and have coffee in the restaurant and just drive around and see what it looks like firsthand. And I know not everyone has time to do that, but it's difficult, I think, if you have an urban life, and especially if you have a family and kids in schools, to have enough time to get outside of that milieu to really spend time in a rural area. But I think it's well worth doing.
You mentioned the agricultural exhibition in Paris. The truth is, the French farmers, especially those who have animals, suicides have been on the rise in the last few years, and there's been quite a few alerts around these suicides. Do you have this over there as well?
Yes. I think Montana and Wyoming have the highest rural suicide rates in the country because both states have large Native American reservations, Native American tribal groups. The suicide rates among those groups are always very high and have been higher. And part of that, I think, is because they don't talk about it when they feel so desperately sad and so desperately overwhelmed. They just keep working and working and working and working until they can't. The culture does not support that kind of emotional sharing, even among families. And I think that is starting to change. There are several programs now, specifically in my area, that are outreach, especially since the pandemic started, outreach to rural farmers. And if there's a grain meeting, or if there's a annual meeting about sheep breeding, those people will be there saying, this is a really hard life and there is some help out there if you're willing to take the first step. So I'm hoping that will improve. But we've had 5 suicides among people that we are aware of just in my very small area in the last 2 years. And 3 out of the 5 were young, in their 20s, just not really seeing, a future, I guess. And the alcohol rate, use of alcohol, is very, very high out here among the ranch community, which doesn't help.
We are looking at the end of these restrictions. How do you think that 2022 will be for you?
I'm very much hoping things are getting better, especially since the varieties of COVID that are cropping up seem to be much less serious. So I am hoping that I will have some school residencies this coming year, or certainly by fall. Once my book comes out, my new book comes out in April, I'll be doing some readings locally. And because I still have a large community of friends in Wyoming, I do have plans probably next fall to try and go down and do a series of readings down there. The difficulty with school residencies here is mostly that the kids got so behind from not being in the classroom, that the schools are not taking as much time for doing any kind of art or music or creative writing, because they're trying to catch the kids up. So it may be another year before that comes back very much. But I'm hoping that I'll get to travel some more. And my partner, who is he was trained as a machinist, but he's a blacksmith and likes making things out of iron and likes working on things. And there's conferences, agricultural conferences, where you can go and see old tractors and old ways of doing things. And he very much likes to do that. And he hasn't been able to get out of the house either very much. So we do hope we're going to be a little bit more liberated as the year goes on.
How do you encourage creative writing in children? How do you appeal to their imagination?
I have found that really the kids have no lack of ideas. When I'm going in with younger children, say, kindergarten or first or second grade, which is 5, 6, 7, when they're just learning to write, their biggest inhibition is that they haven't really mastered writing things down. So we work as a group. I'll start with a prompt or a pattern, a line from a poem, and then just go around the classroom and ask everybody to contribute. A pattern we might use is to pick a number, a color, an animal, an action verb, and a place where they're doing that. So you might have something like 7 blue horses skip rope across the wild prairie chasing tumbleweeds, and use that as a pattern to go through. I've been lucky to be in a number of school systems where grandparents or members of the community will come in and help if a project is going on, so that I have people who little kids can dictate their story or their poem to, rather than having to sit there and laboriously try and make letters that they aren't quite sure of. So doing a lot of oral work first. One of the most fun things is to take in artwork of various sorts, paintings of people or animals or places, and ask the kids to imagine what's going on there. What's that rabbit thinking? Where are the horses going once they go over the edge of the picture? So, and also bringing in poems. There are some nice collections of poems that are written by kids. And so when kids hear poems that are written by other children, and we use those as a pattern, that's really fun for them too, to do, because they are relating to their peer group.
Have you all worked with children with special needs?
Yes, most of the schools here in the United States do what they call mainstreaming. So if a child has special needs, they probably have some time during the day when they are with a specific special needs, special education teacher, but there's also other times when they're in a regular classroom. And if they come into a classroom, if they've come into a classroom when I'm there, there's usually a person with them specifically to help them. So for instance, they might be verbal but not have the ability to write or to spell, so then they can tell their poem to someone. And I found those kids have no lack of ideas at all. Most of the difficulty, even with kids who have mental or intellectual challenges, is often those challenges go along with physical difficulty. Down syndrome kids, for instance, don't have strong grips, so it's harder for them to hold pencils. But they certainly have the most wonderful ideas. So as long as you have someone to help get those ideas down. I taught at a museum for a while with a large group of special needs adults, doing both mixed media arts and then making up stories to go with it. And again, they came in from what you would call their day program into the museum to take various kinds of arts classes, and people came with them. So some of them had higher abilities than others and could work fairly independently. Others needed a little more help. But I found that creativity is as profound and as joyful an experience with those folks as it is with anyone. You know, they get great pleasure from color and texture and the sound of words, and from music and from moving. We did some fun dance stuff at the museum too with them, which was great fun.
Your students, the people, the children you're working with, they are using all their senses during your workshops. You just mentioned, touch, music, sound. Did you find that people respond to a particular medium or to particular sense?
If you read even adult poetry, you become aware pretty quickly that because we're visual animals and we hear things, there's a lot of sound in our environments, and we move through them physically. We work. We even if work is just typing at a keyboard, or we care for our children or our pets. That the hardest senses to get into written work, I think, are smell and taste. So a lot of the exercises that we do when we first start with kids, when we're just saying, okay, let's build a toolbox of things that we can use when we're going to go write another poem here later, but we're going to have a toolbox, is to reawaken them to their senses in funny or humorous ways. So we do go through all their five senses, and I ask them to imagine that what does a tiger taste like? What does the roof smell like? Things that you wouldn't ordinarily put in your mouth or get close to. We talk about being able to get close to them on the page, even if you couldn't do that in reality, and go through all five senses, mixing them with colors and fragrances, and just making themselves a little. I have kids make a personal dictionary of new words or good action verbs, or every colors, taste, smells, so they have that as a little toolbox to use when they write. And kids are very much in their bodies, much more than adults are. So if you say, I saw you flying around the playground this afternoon, they just laugh. They don't look at you like you're a little nuts, which an adult might. Hey, I saw you flying down the street, and they're going, what? So yeah, awakening that sensual thing, because it's your connection to the real world, to what it is as it impacts you in that environment, I think.
My name is B.J. Buckley, and I'm a poet from Montana. This poem, Be as a Ringing Glass, was written from notes I took on a series of walks across the year over the past 2 seasons of pandemic isolation. Be as a Ringing Glass is a line from one of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus, and the whole line is, be as a ringing glass that is already shattered by ringing. Be as a Ringing Glass by B.J. Buckley. Wind scatters fat snowflakes over the barley stubble, late crop of stars, shepherd of frost. Tendrils of fog thread high branches of the Russian olives like memories escaped from old women. Pheasants clatter up, bright cock and 2 hens punctuating the brittle pages of air. Rows of round bales, abacus of summer. The heart makes lists of things it must not forget. Forgets. How to live in this time, in this place, scattering those torn compendiums, those little papers, softer than snow. Poor sheep in the gully, suffocated under drifts, red blotches where the lambs were birthed in white march in the sage. Nothing ever promised justice. Fate spinning her crooked wheel. I've always wanted to touch the deer who come when ice crust locks away the grass, to browse at the sweet yellow bricks of hay. Imagine their rough tongues baptizing the palms of your hands, the soft benediction of their slender ears. If they were gods, they might hear you. In June they will be invisible, sheltered in the windbreak, broken silhouettes of shadow and light.
What soothes you? What relaxes you?
Let's see. I'm also a very amateur musician. So I like especially listening to early music on early instruments. So I listen to music a lot, music without words. I like Baroque music especially. I like a lot of modern. I like Arvo Pärt, who's a modern composer. And John Ritter's another one I like. So putting on music, and I will sometimes do that when I write if I'm somewhere by myself that it won't disturb someone else. I do that in classrooms too. I usually take in a collection of music without words, everywhere from classical to modern kinds of stuff to put on while the kids write, because the sort of regular calming beat allows them to concentrate. I think I take long walks. I like taking long walks in all weathers and just getting away from my usual, writing work, my housework, my cooking, my whatever chores have to be done, and just being out in the world and looking around and moving through it is another very soothing thing for me.
Regarding your visual arts, are you using recycled materials or only new materials?
A lot of recycled materials. There have been 4 or 5 galleries in the various towns I've lived near that during April, when I think it's April is Earth Day, would have recycled art exhibitions. And because many schools, especially rural ones, have small budgets, we've gotten adept, I think, a lot of us who work in those areas at figuring you can take pretty much anything and make art out of it. So we did self-portraits with my special needs people using scraps of material and paper and burlap and window screen and buttons and pretty much anything sort of clean and scrappy that we could bring in. So I've also experimented with doing, we did a wonderful project where we made these little books that opened, and there was a pop-up flower in the middle that we made out of old magazine pages, cut the patterns out of old magazine pages, so we got to use that. New materials generally, if I'm working in healthcare settings, we use new materials because of the necessity for having things that are clean and that can be cleaned. But we made a musical instrument, a water flute, in one school, many years ago, by bringing in bottles and filling them with water and having the kids blow on them. And then we wrote, imagined, what animal might make that sound, and wrote poems about it. So that was a fun thing that we did, recycled. We made a recycled material gamelan at one school I was at, using wooden boxes and bottles and cans and pieces of metal and chain link fence, and made after listening to and watching YouTube of an actual gamelan, we made one of those out of recycled materials. And oh my goodness, that's 30 years ago. It's quite a very long time ago. The university I went to in Connecticut had a gamelan and an international music program. So that was and the other things that you experience, I think, in your life come back to you, because by the time we did the garbage gamelan, it had been, a good while since I'd been in college. But so that's been a fun thing too. We did recycled musical instruments made out of cardboard tubes and coffee cans and bottles and things several times. I did residencies where we were writing songs, so we also made some musical instruments out of recycled materials.
You are now in a library. I know that every library periodically discontinue some of their books, older books. They either send them to a landfill, or they try to sell them or give them away. Do you use these books as material supplies?
Oh, yes. I did a couple of workshops for adults I don't know if there's probably a technical term for it, using books as art materials, and doing everything from cutting the pages to make different designs, painting on the pages, gluing them together, making boxes out of them, redecorating the covers. So yes, especially the big library in town has a book sale every year, and there's always those wonderful big old hardcover books that no one wants anymore. So yes, I've had some fun workshops doing those. There are some real artists who have done just amazing things, and we just mostly dink around with them, but they've been great fun to use. Let me read you one more poem from the book with the crows on there. Here's a final poem. If you live in a rural area in the West, there are birds that you will always see. You will always see magpies and crows and ravens. They're very sturdy birds. They're happy living around people. They eat carrion. They eat the leavings of farm animals. They're always around. And this is a number of years ago, I wrote a book. I got very fascinated with the crows and ravens and magpies that were around in the windbreak around my little place, and spent most of 2 years following them around and listening to them and researching various kinds of stories, and talking with my neighbors about the crows and ravens and magpies, because they're mischievous birds. They can do damage to livestock. Everybody has a story out here. So this is a poem called Crow's Meditation on a Rainy Afternoon. And it gives you a little bit. We all fish out here. There's lakes and rivers, and most of us do some kind of fishing or another at different times of the year. So we know about the fish and the bugs and the birds. And the birds will hang around, all the birds will hang around wherever water is, because the atmosphere is pleasant. So this is called Crow's Meditation on a Rainy Afternoon. Crow thinks thoughts in the mind of God are like barn swallows darting under a dark bridge at the fragile edges of light, morning, evening, hungry for mosquitoes, for the hatches of midge or caddis, or ephemerella whose lives are a single sun in span. Emerge, fly, dance, mate, lay eggs, dance, die falling towards soft ripples of the stream, into the mouths of trout or bluegills sipping at the surface of the water, into swift snatch famished beaks of swallows whose elegant choreography is the perfect objective correlative of the idea of grace. Crow thinks The thinker matters less than the thought. And the thought, unless incarnate in mayfly, swallow, fish, soft wind, eternal, ephemeral, never the same river twice, matters not at all. Crow thinks thinking a sort of play for days when downpours wall of water glass beyond the dense shelter of spruce renders escape imprudent. Foolish to get drenched, Crow knows all floods eventually recede. Crow thinks the imminence of God a kind of flood, a tide that flows and ebbs and at last goes out forever, leaving behind the tangled current under purple-shadowed bridge. Insect hum, barn swallows returning like stray thoughts, called home to quiet nests of mud, secure and hidden, full of eggs and warm against the dark.
My name is B.J. Buckley, and I'm a Montana poet who grew up and spent the first half of my adult life in Wyoming. This poem, Funeral, is about a time when I worked on a 25,000-acre sheep and cattle ranch halfway between Sheridan and Gillette. Funeral by B.J. Buckley. In the cemetery, dry grass waist high, the man hired to mow dead himself, mowing his own sparse hay, hardly worth cutting after months of drought. Forgotten crosses, milk paint white, chewed away by mice, scoured by harsh judgments of wind, fallen all askew like our own failed crooked tries at grace. New grave took 2 days to dig. Curly wouldn't use the backhoe, insisted on his own precise square corners, said it takes a body to bury one, human sweat, human arms to lift the earth away, and after, in the quiet, to set it back down. At the church a little while ago, the part-time preacher waited for the pews to fill, and someone had to tell him 17 was all of us, except for Curly, who was still out there in the wind praying with his shovel. We didn't need the book to sing the hymns or say the prayers, and the preacher hadn't known old Emmett, so Clay stood to give the eulogy, short and sweet, Ecclesiastes, those verses like a poem about the seasons, and that verse about flesh and grass, which for us was literal as well as spiritual, and was waiting on us pitching out the bales when this was done.